Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 18th of February of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting details, updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Avdiivka direction. As you can see, we continue receiving significant number of details, geolocations and so on. And today we received as well a lot of very interesting details from the Ukrainian side about Avdiivka, mainly from the office of the President of Ukraine and the office of Commander-in-Chief Syrsky. And the problem is that now the Ukrainians are planning to start the process of investigation, the investigation process against the 3rd Azov Brigade, trying to find out why the 3rd Azov Brigade took a decision not to start, let's say, the release operation, the blocking operation, why they refused to follow the orders or something like this. And obviously this is going to be a very loud process. Very likely a lot of people from that brigade will be captured and arrested. But this is not the main problem of the situation of the aftermath after Avdiivka battle situation. Another important thing is that the present office of Zelensky tried to start investigation against significant number of soldiers and officers of Avdiivka itself. And the main reason of that is that Ukrainians, there was a period of time during the most fierce period of clashes for Avdiivka. There was a moment when the local officers on the ground start making negotiation process with Russian officers and Russian authorities behind the Zelensky office and Syrsky office. What I'm trying to say, let's assume that during the withdrawing process, during the retreat process, when the Ukrainians were moving from the eastern part of Avdiivka along the streets to the 9th quarter, or when the Ukrainians were in 9th quarter and were trying to leave this area, lots of the Russians all the time were attacking the Ukrainians. And of course there were significant number of cases when, let's say, somewhere along Miru Street, some Ukrainian soldiers were encircled by the Russians, let's say, right? And the thing is that neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians had possibilities to communicate because of some problems with communication and something like this. So that's why the Ukrainian officers who, let's say, were somewhere in Orlovka had let's say, strict connection with the Russian officers. They had the connections and they were asking them, let's say, don't kill Ukrainian soldiers who were abandoned and, let's say, trapped on Miru Street because they are ready to surrender. They want to surrender, just don't kill them. We are giving you this signal. Please don't attack them, and they want to surrender. So that was cases like this. Or let's say when the Ukrainians were withdrawing their positions and abandoning their positions some along the railways, and the Russians managed, let's say, to encircle them from many sides, and because of absence of communication between the squads on the ground, another, let's say, call from Ukrainians, some from, let's say, Acheretina to the Russian soldiers, asking them not to kill these Ukrainians and to take them as prisoners of war because they're ready to surrender. And there was significant number of such cases because, according to information we have, according to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, the total losses of the Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours were around 1,500 soldiers, and according to the Russian sources, they managed to let's say capture more than 500 soldiers at by 3 p.m. of the local time, and most of them were captured as a result of those negotiations between Ukrainian and Russian officers on the ground, and those negotiations were behind Zelensky office, and that's why Zelensky was very upset with that and Zelensky office, because this is a very bad case. This is a very bad situation. Why these officers on the ground took a decision to make these negotiations without letting them know, without, let's say, approval from Syrsky or approval from Zelensky himself. Of course, for Zelensky it would be much more better picture to see, let's say, the fighting till the last Ukrainian, let's say, to show to heroes, to show, let's say, your personal, let's say, I don't know how to call it even in English, so I believe you understand what I'm trying to say. So that's why the Zelensky wants to start an investigation among these officers, and he also wants to get them to jail, because it's a very bad accident, very bad case, because now everybody all over the line of combat contact, starting from Kupiansk to Zaporozhye area, can start this type of negotiations without any consequences for them. So this is very critical. Obviously, the consequences of Avdiivka battle, the real consequences, and the, let's say, the number of events that are going to take place after the battle. So we will see, we will hear and see and feel a lot of months later in summer or even autumn of 2024. When talking about the situation on the ground, of course, the most important updates are coming from Lastachkina. According to information we have, the Russians continue their offensive operation to the west, trying to establish control over the village. But there are a few things I would like to discuss with you about this area. According to some Russians, this territory was completely captured by the Russians, yet we haven't received even a single geolocated confirmation of such a progress, but most of the mappers have already updated their map showing this territory under Russian control, and I have a few questions about this. First of all, let's wait a little bit. I'm not saying that the Russians haven't managed to establish control. Maybe they have, but the problem is that we need to understand what was this attack for. First of all, this might be, let's say, the further Russian progress and attempt to continue offensive operation. Why the Ukrainians are disorganized, why their communications are broken, why they don't understand where exactly they need to move, to retreat, and so on. And this is like a very good and nice opportunity for the Russians to continue offensive and to establish control not just over Lastachkina, but to create a lot of risks for Severnaya, Tonenькая, and Orlovka as well. As we discussed, to complete in the previous video, to complete Avdiivka operation, the Russians need to establish control over every single village until the next Ukrainian defense belt. But from the other side, we understand that this offensive operation to Lastachkina, the Russians started, let's say, on the 15th of February, during the final hours of Avdiivka, and the main purpose of that attack from the Russian side was not to, let's say, to continue offensive on the shoulders of Ukrainian soldiers, but to create a cauldron and to close as many as possible Ukrainians inside of Avdiivka, as many as possible, because according to information we have, few thousands of Ukrainian soldiers managed to bypass through fields, maybe not thousands, maybe hundreds, maybe around 1,000, and 1,500 was captured, and the Ukrainians had losses inside of Avdiivka. 500 from those 1,500 were captured as prisoners of war. The Ukrainian sources are saying about 800 soldiers. So the original plan of attack in the direction of Lastachkina was to cut the main evacuation road from 9th quarter in direction of course, Lastachkina itself and to Severna, so to cut this area. And now when the battle for Avdiivka has ended and when the Russians managed to complete everything they needed and required, there is a very big question whether they need this Lastachkina at least at this moment or not, because anyway, the cities, the villages like Severnaya, Tonenькая, Lastachkina, and Orlovka are located in the lowland, and anyway, sooner or later the Ukrainians will be forced to step back from these territories due to this, let's say, difference in the on the ground of this area and, let's say, Avdiivka itself and the northern part of Donetsk and so on. So we need to wait, because if the Russians continue offensive, that means that they do really want on the shoulders of the Ukrainians to continue offensive further. But if they stop, very likely that the Russians during the next few days will take a decision to regroup and to retreat back to Avdiivka, to the administrative borders of the stronghold, to complete the clearing operation of this village, of the stronghold, to demine area, to make regrouping, to bring fresh forces, to bomb and reduce till ruins all these villages, and then to start everything from the beginning. So for now, all updates about Lastachkina is just like updates that we need to keep in our mind, but we need to understand what are the Russians planning to do next. So for now, I have, let's say, a lot of questions about further Russian plans, at least in Avdiivka direction, but very likely that the Russians will continue. Furthermore, as we discussed in the morning, I would like to discuss with you this once again. Most of the military experts, including the Institute of Study of War, and I completely agree with them, the Russians managed to achieve significant results in Avdiivka because of complete air superiority, because of complete superiority of Su-35, Su-30, and Su-34. The Russians bombed Avdiivka heavily with significant number of aviation bombs, and the Ukrainians were completely useless. Air defense of Ukraine were completely useless against the Russian, let's say, forces, and that was the reason. And the most important, once again, if the Russians are able to develop and to spread these tactics all over the line of combat contact, very likely that in the 2024 the Russians will be able to get Dnipro River if the Ukrainians are not able to restore their air defense or something like this. Furthermore, we got a very interesting video, and I would like to pay your attention to the video, to event that took place on the southern part of the ninth quarter. This is a very interesting and very important video. On this footage, we can see almost destroyed Avdiivka, reduced to ruins, like the sack Bakhmut number 2, the Russians with flags. But the most important scene I would like to point your attention is the next, let's say, scene, the next footage, and I'm talking about the church on the south of Avdiivka. And you know, that's I believe that this is a miracle. As you can see, the buildings right in a few in tens meters from the church were completely reduced to ruins. And if we take a look at the church wasn't almost damaged neither by the Russians nor by the Ukrainians since the beginning of the special military operation, to be more precise, since 2014, because as you can see, this is edge position of Ukraine armed forces, and this is very important. And by these scenes, by this video, I would like to show you and to tell you that regarding the situation between Ukraine and Russia, regarding the situation of the special military operation, regarding the fact that the Ukrainians and Russians are enemies to each other, and the Russians are trying to complete the special military operation, the Ukrainians are trying to, I don't know, to keep everything as is. We see that there are still a lot of common things between these two nations, between Russia and between Ukraine, and I'm talking about Orthodox, about culture, about its religion. And we see that regarding this nightmare and hell on the ground, we see a small light in the souls either of the Russians and the Ukrainians, and both of them, either the Russians and the Ukrainians, are afraid of God, and they don't want to destroy the church. They try to, regarding this situation, they want to keep the culture and they want to keep their own, I don't know, some soul or something like this. And this is very important. This is like something like a light in this black, I don't know, tunnel. It is like the light in the end of this black tunnel. So something common that still exists between these two nations. And now we are moving to the further front lines of the same area. I would like to discuss with you South Donetsk direction. We continue receiving significant number of updates from the village by the name of Pobeda. The Russians continue bombing and attacking this territory with significant number of artillery rounds, with aviation bombs and many other different types of weapons. And we see that the Russians are trying to speed up the Pobeda offensive operation. And the thing is that we know that currently the Russians are advancing along Novomikhailivka, and we, for example, for today we haven't received anything about the village, but we understand that the Russians continue offensive, that very likely they are very successful, and so on. And we see that the Russian army that are moving through Pobeda is losing its timings. It's not to complete everything by time. And today we receive significant number of geolocations, including bombing. And for example, today the Russians also destroyed the Leopard that was abandoned yesterday by the Ukrainians. If you remember, we discussed that. My conclusion was that the Ukrainians basically abandoned the tank because they didn't want to fight, because Leopard is target number 1. And just the video was published, and let's say a few hours later we received the video how the Russians were destroying that Leopard with FPV drones. So it's like a logic, just a logic. Sometimes Western weapon on the ground is not like a good thing. It's a curse. It's a curse that makes you target number 1 for the Russian forces. So it only if you have some superiority with Western weapon, then you can count on the weapon. But when there are just few pieces of these types of weapon, it's more curse than, let's say, some advantage or benefit for you or your crew. And the Russians continue storming the 3 lines to the south of Pobeda. Today we got additional geolocation of FPV drone strikes against the Ukrainian forces, which confirms the further Russian plans to move to the south in direction of Novomikhailivka, and to be more precise, in direction of this stronghold. So very likely the next 48 hours we're going to receive more updates about this territory, and maybe the Russians will try to establish control over this stronghold, and then the Russians can continue movements further to the Novomikhailivka from the north. Anyway, I don't think that in a week we're going to see the same picture. Obviously, in a week we're going to see completely different picture on the line between Pobeda and Novomikhailivka. I'm talking about the progress on the territory on the ground. Now we are moving to Rabotina area, to Zaporozhye directions, and during the previous 48 hours we received significant number of details and updates about this territory. The Russians are attacking the Ukrainian positions, and according to information we have, the Ukrainians were forced to already abandon some positions, and very very likely that within the next 48 hours we're gonna start receiving updates from Robotina itself, and the second battle for the village will start. Let's start from the beginning, step by step. According to information we have, according to pro-Ukrainian deep state map, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to restore control over some positions to the west of Verbova. Significant progress. And if we move back to military summary map, this is something like a progress of the Russians as according to deep state, yet we haven't received even a single geolocated confirmation of that. But anyway, this is like important advance, and which will force sooner or later to withdraw positions of 82nd Air Assault Brigade further to the east in direction of Robotina itself, or as close as possible to Novodanilovka, to main supply roads, to the central part of the fields. Obviously the Ukrainians will step back, will abandon their positions without any support. And when talking about Robotina itself, today the Russians conducted, at least during the previous 24 hours, conducted at least 2 attacks, very big attacks that were stretched and split into a few small ones. The attacks took place to the southern part, and we have geolocations of those attacks. On this video, for example, we can see another Russian armored personnel carrier with infantry heading to Robotina and to the stronghold, to these trenches. The Russians were moving something like this, and when they entered this territory, the infantry landed on the ground and started clearing operation. So based on that video, most of the mappers have updated their maps showing the Russian progress along the trenches to the south of Robotina. Additional attack took place to the northwest of Novoprokopovka. On this video we can see how the Russians were using at least 2 armored vehicles, 1 tank and probably 1 personnel carrier heading to Robotina itself. The Ukrainians were trying to bomb to slow down the Russians. As I understand, the Russians couldn't stop them. The Ukrainians couldn't stop the Russians. The Russians reached the target, landed the infantry, and also started clearing operation. So according to that video, the Russians were moving something like this, and then from this point they were moving to the north. They landed infantry somewhere here, and after that they started clearing operations. So we can say that as a result of that attack, they managed to improve their positions on the western part of Robotina, and let's say from these 3 lines the Russians can see the first building of Robotina itself. So tomorrow, maybe the day after tomorrow, the battle inside of the village will start. During the day the Russians were bombing the central part of the village with multi-launch rocket system, with artillery forces, with the purpose not to allow the Ukrainians to redeploy reserves to the south or to the west. Very likely the Russians managed to do this, because I don't think that anyone can have some wish or need to move through the city while the Russians were bombing this village so hard. Obviously the Russians managed to achieve some results, and the most important attacks took place today to the northwest of Robotina. There were 2 attacks, and both of them the Russians tried to conduct in direction of T0408 road, and we don't know the results of those attacks. The only thing, we have some geolocated video from 65th Mechanized Brigade, from their FPV drone squad group. The Ukrainians tried to slow down the Russian attacks of tanks and armored personnel carriers heading to those roads with FPV drones. They were attacking them all along the roads, all along the attack, but as I understand, they haven't managed to stop them. The Russians reached the target, landed the infantry, and started the clearing operation. So that was another wave of attack, another attack, and as a result of that attack, very likely, those attacks to be more precise, the Russians very likely managed to establish control over something like this. For now, we haven't received any geolocated confirmation of any of Russian progress, just attacks that were published by the Ukrainians, but the same story took place in Avdiivka. We received most of updates we were receiving from the Ukrainians of how they were bombing and attacking the Russians with FPV drones, and then at some point the entire Avdiivka collapsed and the Ukrainians were forced to step back. Now the same story, we see significant number of videos from the Ukrainian side of how they were bombing the Russians, and at some point the entire Robotina and Verbova fields will be collapsed and captured by the Russians. During those attacks, the Russians established complete control over the main supply road between Robotina and Novodanilovka with FPV drones. Few light vehicles, a few support supply machines were trying to move through the road, but most of them were destroyed as a result of FPV drone strikes. So we see very well planned, organized biggest offensive operation from the Russian side. Artillery strikes, multi-launch rocket strikes, FPV drone control over supply roads, and additional progress and attempts to attack the tree lines to the west and south and around Robotina itself. So we'll keep waiting for more updates. Obviously, we're going to receive some. And additional activity we can find on this West Zaporozhye direction. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians published an additional video of multi-launch rocket bombing of Kamyanska itself. Very likely the Russians were attacking the Ukrainian temporary positions, the operational reserves, trying to pin them down and not to allow the Ukrainians to redeploy some forces to Robotina itself. So it's the closest area, just a few tens kilometers between this area and, let's say, Robotina itself. So very likely operational reserves were redeployed in this area. Furthermore, the Russians were bombing and attacking Petykhatki itself. For now, it's just the stage of artillery, of aviation bombing and FPV drone strike. When talking about Kamyanska direction, the Russians still haven't launched the ground operation. But if another important update is coming from Orikhiv itself, and according to information we have, the local administration, the local authorities announced about evacuation as soon as possible. So everything will be evacuated from Orikhiv, including civilians, like government offices, and many other things. They will move further to Zaporozhye, and based on all these updates, like the clashes in Robotina, the activity in Kamyansk, evacuation in Orikhiv, and if we increase the numbers of updates since the beginning of February, we can say that the Russians are planning to establish control over something like this. They're going to move to the north in direction of Veselyanka, then to Kamyshevakha, Zarechna, Tavriska, Yurivka, Orikhiv itself, and Novoprokopovka, Robotina, Verbova. So approximately this is something that the Russians are planning to establish control, if they are planning to establish control, of course. Because according to information we have, the Russians concentrated significant number of forces, they concentrated more forces that they concentrated before Avdiivka offensive operations. So there are around 60,000 soldiers that the Russians can use, and obviously 60,000 soldiers is more than enough to establish control just over Robotina, and it will be enough obviously to even establish control over this territory. And once again, if the Russians are going to use the same tactics as they used to use in Avdiivka, I'm talking about complete air superiority of Su-34, Su-30, Su-35. If the Russians are going to bomb this territory with FABs heavily as they bomb Avdiivka, obviously I have no doubts that the Russians are able to establish control over this territory, and much faster than the Avdiivka and so on. Probably the Russians are going to need up to 2 months if they're going to use the benefits of aviation superiority. But another important thing that we need to understand, that the Russians have improved their tactics. There are a lot of smart generals and commanders, and not very likely, but I must say that the chances like a little bit around 30% that this attack may be something like a secondary attack with the purpose to force the Ukrainians to redeploy reserves somewhere from the north as far as possible from the line of combat contact, from the line of primary attack in direction of Zaporozhye. And when the Ukrainians redeploy forces, the Russians will launch the real offensive operation. Once again, the Ukrainians have significant problems in Novomykhailovka, and obviously as soon as Novomykhailovka falls, the Russians may start full-scale offensive operation in this direction, and most of reserves by the time will be redeployed to Zaporozhye. Once again, don't forget about significant Russian progress in the vicinity of Bakhmut. Today, for example, the pro-Ukrainian sources, Deep State, confirmed that the Russians managed to reach the outskirts of Ivanovska itself and even to capture the first streets of the village. So very likely that the Russians can start full-scale, that this is the primary Russian target, and attack in Zaporozhye, the main purpose of attacking Zaporozhye, to force the Ukrainians to redeploy reserves from this direction there. And always, as usually, don't forget about Liman and Terny direction, because today we got additional updates about additional Russian progress in the fields, and according to some mappers, the Russians established control over this territory, and sooner or later the Russians will get the outskirts of Zhiribets, of Terny, Yampolovka area, and there are going to be very heavy clashes, and The Russians very likely, and there are chances that the Russians are trying to attack in Zaporozhye with the purpose to redeploy reserves from this direction as well. So for now, it's too early to judge and to make conclusions about Zaporozhye in Avdiivka. Obviously, we need few days, and this is the most important thing, because the Ukrainians as well, they are in the same situation as we, because there are just Putin, probably Gerasimov, maybe Shoigu, maybe a few more generals who currently understand and know what the Russians are planning to do next. Neither me, military summary, nor deep state, nor Ukrainians, nor the Western countries, nor Pentagon, nor Germany, neither intelligence in the world concretely understand what the Russians are planning to do next. And obviously, the Russians will use this situation with the fog of war to determine where to attack next. And once again, I have a third feeling, if you want to say, that Zaporozhye is something like to attract Ukrainian attention and to attract as many as possible reserves. I believe that the Russians have other plans, and we will be very surprised probably, but maybe I'm wrong, who knows. For now, it's not so many of updates and details and numbers to understand where the Russians are planning to attack next. Anyway, we'll see. Within the next, we're gonna understand everything. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.